Today we're going to discuss procurement. There are different levels to procurement and they must be followed with the regulations for the state as well as the USDA. First, you have micro purchases, and these are purchases where the amount does not exceed $10,000. For micro purchases, CNP operators must review the local and state purchasing policies and requirements to ensure proper procurement practices are followed. Purchases under micro purchases should not be intentionally divided to avoid getting quotes. However, it is advised that you do share the wealth among different vendors. So again, micro purchases should not exceed $10,000. Also with micro purchases, prices should be reasonable. To the extent purchases should be distributed equitably among all qualified suppliers offering the same similar services. And as with any method of procurement, adequate documentation must be maintained, meaning you must save receipts and invoices. The next level on the procurement ladder is small purchases. And these are where the aggregate amount is more than $10,000 to the most restrictive bid limit for the agency, or up to $250,000 for non-government agencies and unprocessed agricultural products. Well, for small purchases, quotes must be obtained from 2 or more sources. And if the purchase is above the most restrictive micro purchase threshold, small purchase may be used. So in small purchases, you have solicitation, evaluation and award, and contract management. The solicitation process under the small purchases method, solicitation must be compliant with the requirements for the appropriate threshold. 2 or more quotes must be obtained, and you must restrict competition, and there must be restricting competition. Evaluation and award, you must maintain records that detail the significant history of the procurement. The correct vendor must be selected based on product, services requested, and vendor responses provided. Contract management, the correct product must be solicited. The correct price quote must be charged to the nonprofit food account. These are just some regulations that are associated with soliciting, restricting competition, and these are within the USDA regulations. Now for formal procurement, these are usually your invitation for bids, your request for proposals, and your non-competitive contracts. Formal procurement exceeds the most restrictive bid limit for the agency and is up to $250,000 for non-government agencies and unprocessed agricultural products. Formal contracts or formal procurement, they are identified as invitation for bids, which must result in firm fixed price contracts awarded to responsive and responsible bidders, lowest in price. These awards can be by line item, food grouping, or total bottom line. And it can also include price escalation clauses, which should always be included in a milk bid. Your request for proposals, or RFPs, are contracts awarded to the most responsible firm whose proposal is most advantageous to the program and other factors considered. And requests for proposals, price must be a primary factor, then the other factors. They must also describe the evaluation method, the evaluation factors, and how these factors will be weighted and scored. However, in your non-competitive contracts, this is where an item is only available from a single source. In most cases, they are emergency contracts, and these contracts are authorized by the Food and Nutrition Service or state agency. And these are contracts where competition is determined inadequate. Now, there are steps in formal procurement. You have your general solicitation process, evaluation and award, contract management, and your general solicitation process. You must ensure that the method meets the requirement for the threshold, that you forecast and you do an analysis on the cost, and that you make sure that your solicitation content contains everything before you solicit the bid, and you must also advertise the solicitation. Your general solicitation process. These are just regulations that are associated with this. And 7 CFR Part 226.22, the contract must be procured in compliance with the requirements for the appropriate threshold, and this is on the federal, state, and local level. And in this process, a cost price analysis must be conducted to estimate the cost of goods or services prior to soliciting the bid. The solicitation content, the content in which should be contained in the bid that you solicit for vendors to respond to. You must identify all specifications, evaluation factors, and their relative importance with price as the primary factor. You must seek and invite 2 or more qualified sources willing and able to compete. If you do not receive more than 2 or more qualified responses, just keep documentation and notify the state agency. You must include the requirement for contract award to the lowest responsive and responsible bidder, or bid offer that's most advantageous to the program with price and other factors considered. And as stated before, price must be the primary factor. Advertising the solicitation. Once you advertise the solicitation, you must provide adequate time for bidders to respond prior to the bid opening date. You must use very qualified sources to advertise the solicitation. This can be by newspaper, social media, but it must be publicly advertised so that you can secure more than one bid, one offer. The technical evaluation. RFPs must have a written method for conducting technical evaluations of proposals to select recipients. Criteria in which the technical evaluation is done is criteria that will be scored, criteria that will be weighted, and a composition and process for panel evaluation. And these are just some required clauses that are included in some of the contracts. As you can see, there are a couple that are applicable to all contracts, while some are just designated to contracts in excess of a certain amount of money. Evaluation and award. Your invitation for bids. All bids must be open at the time and place prescribed. And as stated in the previous slide, a firm fixed price contract must be awarded to the lowest responsive and responsible bidder. And also all bids, and this goes for RFPs as well, all bids must be sealed prior to the bid opening. And these are just some further regulations that apply to the RFPs and invitation for bids. The contract management process. Even if you secure a contract with, let's say, a food service management company, it is still your responsibility as a CMP operator to provide sufficient oversight of the procurement to ensure that contractors, vendors are performing in accordance with the terms, conditions, and specifications of their contracts. If geographic preference was used, the CNP operator must evaluate vendor compliance. Solicitation. In some contracts, in some areas where there is one specific vendor or one provider of services or goods, sponsors can piggyback off of a contract, and we call this sort of like a co-op. However, if you do piggyback, you want each sponsor is to maintain documentation for their contract. And if there are any material changes, notify the state so that we can approve those changes or discuss why those changes cannot be made. Solicitation, IFBs, and RFP agents. If the sponsor or CNP operator uses an agent, they must be compliant with procuring the agent services using applicable procurement standards, and the agent must be compliant with the program and government-wide regulations. When it comes to third-party entities, if a third-party entity is used, the sponsor must be compliant with using the third party's pricing as one source when soliciting price rate quotes. Market basket analysis. Market basket analysis is a method in which you are creating a list of goods or services that are needed, and you are kind of shopping around, ensuring that trying to find a vendor that can provide all of these goods, or even if you're splitting up the list. But market basket analysis is just making a list of all goods to be purchased and just shopping around to different vendors to make sure that you find the lowest price. And this is just the table that is used when it comes to market basket analysis. General procurement practices. Each CNP operator sponsor must have documented procurement procedures. You must have a procurement plan, and within this procurement plan, you must have a written code of conduct that prohibits officers, employees, and agents from accepting gratuities or favors from contractors or potential contractors. Within this code of conduct, it must list disciplinary actions for violations, includes language that the sponsor will neither solicit nor accept gratuities from contractors or parties to subcontracts. Sponsors must perform a cost of price analysis with every procurement action, and they must also take steps to ensure that small minority and women's businesses and enterprises and labor surplus firms are used when possible. Now, emergency procurement, is when a vendor may, for example, void out a contract and you still need to purchase goods or services. That's when you notify the agency. You notify your superintendent, director, your highest ranking official, and they send a letter to the state agency letting us know that there's a need for emergency procurement. Now, with any method of procurement, you want to make sure that you retain any information, all documentation from the vendor who's ceasing services or ceasing the provision of goods. You want to make sure that you keep all that information. And failure to plan for transition in the midst of emergency procurement, you want to make sure that you are still in the process of trying to locate a new vendor. In emergency procurement, you want to make sure that you maintain documentation, explanation of the rationale for the method of procurement, the contract type, the basis for the contract price. You want to make sure that within this documentation, you're showing the distributor, processor that canceled food or supply contracts, and showing that this documentation must also show that that vendor that canceled food or supply contract is no longer able to provide as ordered or deliver goods. Again, you want to make sure you retain documentation, whether it be email, a phone conversation, or anything that they send. And any approval emergency procurement is limited to 60 days. Thank you.